I'm feeling really led today to share about my season that I had where I suffered really debilitating imposter syndrome. I think a lot of people, especially women, experience this, but it's hard to talk about because I think, first of all, it's either normalized to the point where like, oh, everyone has imposter syndrome. It's just something that you deal with. Like I remember my orientation in my new job, they talked about that. Like, oh, this is just what's gonna be expected. You'll have severe imposter syndrome. And I didn't really know what that meant until I really experienced it firsthand. It was normalized. It was like, this is just how things are. And you just kind of have to like deal with it. And I think that's still very common in our society and our culture, is just to kind of be like, well, that's just how things are, and not really talk about ways of getting through it or overcoming it, which I want to talk about because I definitely felt like God just broke off a lot of that in a miraculous way, and I'll share more about that. But secondly, I think, on the flip side, for a lot of people, it's just hard to talk about because you don't want to come off like you're complaining or like, woe is me, and like self-pitying yourself. So I think a lot of people, especially those of you, similar to my background, growing up Asian, growing up as a female leader, especially, you feel like you have to put this strong front up, even for yourself, right? Like, I'm a strong person, I must be strong, and nothing's gonna faze me. So it's hard to just be real and honest, not just with other people, but even with yourself and with God, of like, oh, actually I am dealing with imposter syndrome and I need help and I don't know what to do about it. Oftentimes we stuff it down or ignore it. I just want to talk about this because I know a lot of people struggle with it, just from conversations with people and also through me and my husband's coaching and ministry that we've done too. So I hope this story really encourages you who are going through that. So when I first started my job at Google, this was my first job out of college. How I ended up at Google was actually really miraculous. I'm planning to share the full story of that sometime on my channel, so make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss that, because that is one of the biggest testimonies that I always look back on where I'm like, God is totally real. And that is just so crazy how I ended up at Google without even applying for it. And it's a long story, but I've been taking my time with like bigger testimonies in my life because I just want to do them justice and I want to be ready to like tell it well. So the long story short of it though was, yeah, I didn't apply to the job, but I ended up getting the job. And I had already, previous to this, leading up to it, I already felt like the odd one out in many situations. I went to UC Berkeley, which was also like weird to me because I struggled in school a lot. Looking back, I didn't know it back then, but I had ADHD and I also had just different ways of learning, and school a certain way was like super frustrating to me because I felt like I had to work like 7-10 times as hard as other people just to get the same results. But I also like pushed myself to go above and beyond and like overachieve. So it was very surprising to me like how I even got into UC Berkeley, and like even choosing to go was a big step, big leap of faith for myself. But I really felt like God was in it, like telling me to go, which is crazy. Another story for another time. So yeah, just like ever since going to like, especially in college, being like, why am I here? Everyone here is so smart and so academic and studious, and I could barely read through these few paragraphs without like getting distracted and discouraged. And I was just constantly on this feeling of like, I don't belong here. Like, I don't qualify to be here. In my head, I was like, I'm not supposed to be here by my own abilities, except that God brought me here. And then same thing into business school. I went to the undergraduate business program at UC Berkeley, the Haas Business School. And I also felt like the odd one out all the time. There's this phrase that's like thrown around at the school where people call people in the school hossholes because they're like corporate climbers, very aggressive, get out of my way to do what I want to do and get ahead in the business world and things like that. And I was just totally not that at all. I would always get people very surprised that I was in Haas because they're like, you don't seem like the Haas type, which was a compliment in terms of like, oh, that means I'm not like a jerk. But then also like kind of reinforced my own imposter syndrome that I had lifelong like been carrying. Yeah, I don't belong. Like, what am I doing here? Like, how am I gonna succeed when I don't fit into this group, this community? I'm not like most people around me. And in college, I already experienced that a lot. And then now it was like the next level of imposter syndrome at Google. It was like Google, like that brand was like so envied. And like, I think a lot of people were like, wow, like you're like working at Google. Like there's this kind of like glorification about it, right? Which, yeah, that's a long story that again, I'll share my testimony how God like helped me just totally surrender that. So I did not have that attachment at all when I got the job. I was like, this is just a job. I'm just gonna be here if God wants me to be here. And if he doesn't give me the job, like that's fine too. I'm gonna be okay. Like God's plans are perfect. But lo and behold, so I'm at Google, like I get the job and I'm like, what am I doing here? Like this is literally the next level, surrounded by like the top, the smartest, the most type A, the most high achieving people who a bunch of them went to Ivy Leagues or were valedictorians, just like did really well in school and in their past job experiences. Whereas I really struggled like in school, even though I got decent, good grades. But again, like I was explaining earlier, it was a grind for me to even get there. So I didn't feel like I really was that quote unquote academically smart or like a high performer. I was just kind of like faking it till I made it. On top of that, I didn't have like an impressive resume of like working at all these big companies. I had just like done, internships, volunteering at places, but like a lot of them were startups or even failed startups or nonprofits. You wouldn't be like blown away looking at my resume. I just kind of did things that interested me that I wanted to learn and grow in, and I was like, oh, opportunities to learn. But that's why it was such a surprise when I actually got reached out to by Google. But then also when I actually got into Google, I was like, what am I doing here? All of that context gives you a better picture of like, I feel like the first week was pretty decent. It was like, okay, new environment, like this is really exciting. I'm finally like working, in a full-time job. I had always wanted to, I had been looking forward to that for a long time. I always loved and had this propensity to be like, I want to go like earn money and, use my talents and gifts, in the world and actually apply it rather than just in theory, like in a classroom. So I was really excited, just taking everything in. But then very quickly, I would say probably like within the first two, definitely 3 weeks, it became this like debilitating, like this like weight that I was carrying of, oh my gosh, what the heck am I doing here? Everyone's so smart, so qualified. Like, I don't want to bother people asking them questions. I don't even know what questions to ask. Like people, they would always say like, ask questions, if you're new, this is your chance. Like no one's going to judge you. There's no such thing as stupid questions. But I honestly was like, I can only think of what would be stupid questions. Like, I don't know what questions to ask because I don't know what I don't know. And yeah, so I just felt very much like a fish out of water again, but literally to the next level. And this was made worse because I had a very difficult time with my first manager. I had a lot of like triggers coming up, emotionally speaking, that I hadn't even dealt with. I didn't even know I had, because a lot of like his style of leading and managing and interacting with me reminded me a lot subconsciously of my dad, and like having a strained relationship with my dad, and like performance anxiety, like the pressure to perform and do everything right and not upset him. It's very deep. But back then I didn't see it that way. I just knew like I got super anxious around my manager, even like talking to him, and we were like polar opposite personalities. Like I was more like social and outgoing and wanting to connect like on an emotional level, like, yeah, how are you doing? How's your family? Like things like that. Totally different personality style and type. At the same time, I also knew, okay, he's also a newish manager. So I knew he was also kind of like learning the ropes too, but I just couldn't help feeling so much shame, just so bad about myself when I would mess up on things. Because you're fresh out of college, you have no idea how to operate, like how to work through corporate politics or higher ups or negotiations or working cross-functionally, and like the little things that you only come with experience and time and practice that you just don't know. So I remember making a lot of mistakes, especially this one time. I was trying to be proactive and set up like these meetings with a different team with both me and my manager, because I was like, oh, he like wants me to do this, I'll just like go ahead and do it so he doesn't have to worry about it. But then apparently the way I did it was like not the right way or the best way. Like I should have done more, leading up to the meeting, like talking about it and things. I forget the exact details, but all I remember was he was really upset like about it. And I think he didn't know how to communicate that either to me in a healthy way. So we had just like this very tense conversation that almost just broke me. I just remember being on the verge of tears, being like, oh my gosh, I'm doing everything I can to try to perform well, to try to impress you, to try to go above and beyond, and help as much as I can, but I'm doing everything wrong. And I'm doing not everything, but in my head, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is so frustrating. I just felt so bad about myself too. So that just like culminated. That I feel like that was like the peak of my ultimate imposter syndrome. And I remember just questioning and asking God, like, God, why did you put me here? Why did you bring me here? I don't belong here. This is just so out of my league. And everyone here is like so smart and so sharp, and I don't feel like I belong, So I was just having all of these doubts in prayer, like just pouring all of that to God in my despair and in my self-doubt and discouragement. I remember so clearly God like convicting me, lovingly convicting me, saying, that I brought you here and I don't make mistakes. Basically, who are you to question me and think I would make a mistake? And I was like, oh, shoot. And over the years, I've loved reading more and more about Moses and his story and how he was super imposter syndrome too when God called him from the burning bush, to do this big task, this really giant task to go free the Israelite slaves out of Egypt. And they've been slaves for hundreds of years. And Moses is like, what the heck? Like, who am I to do this? Like, I felt the exact same way. Like, who am I to be here? But I didn't even know why I was really there. So that was even harder because I didn't even know like what my clear mission really was going to be, which God would reveal. But yeah, when I first joined, I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing here at all. I don't belong, and just beating myself up about it. When I got quiet, when I got alone with God, just pouring my heart out again, I just heard him say like, who are you to question me? I don't make mistakes. And that gave me a lot of encouragement of like, yeah, actually, just because I didn't get here on my own strengths and qualifications doesn't mean I don't belong here. It just gave me a deeper revelation of seeing myself as qualified not by my own abilities, but by God's grace, and his purpose for me being there was already the qualification. I had to just trust that I was there for a reason. And so what I did was I asked God, he gave me this funny phrase in my head. Like there's this phrase that a lot of Christians know. It's like the fear of man, because that's talked about a lot in the Bible. One of my favorite verses is in Galatians, and it talks about like, are you living to please man or to please God? Because if you're living to please man, you would not be a servant of Christ. If we are living to please people, we can't focus on pleasing God and serving him. Our judgment is clouded. Our vision is clouded. We're so focused on what will people think, like what do people want and how to impress them, how to please them. And of course, it's not saying like don't care about people's feelings and what they want and what they need. Ultimately, like what is your priority and what are you being dictated by? And for me, for a long time in my life, just because of my prior conditioning of a lot of what I had learned and picked up was I need to do everything I can to bend over backwards and tiptoe around things so that other people will be happy, and that's what makes me a good person. And so I had that people-pleasing tendency so deeply ingrained that I didn't realize that had been what was like making me so anxious around my manager. Basically, the fear of man in this case was a fear of my manager. I remember God just saying, like, giving me that phrase, like, fear of manager is what I want you to really surrender. Don't let that hold you back. I really just like gave it up to God. I was like, okay, like, God, help me. I don't know how to overcome this on my own. And we're not supposed to. Like, even our own faith, it says in Hebrews 12, like, Jesus is the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So even our own faith, our own spiritual transformation, our own growth, we need God. We need Jesus and his help and his grace, his mercy to help us through that. Like, we can't just self-will ourselves to become, transformed. It's like a partnership. It's like God will do like the heavy lifting, but we also need to surrender. We need to be open and invite him into that, in humility. So that's really what I did, was like, God, help me break off this fear of manager. I don't want to be so anxious and intimidated every time I'm around my manager, every time he's talking to me or wanting something from me, and I'm just like so afraid. And then secondly, I also felt God just prompt me to just start asking God, show me why I'm here. Like, would you just show me the spiritual landscape and the spiritual atmosphere of my workplace, of this office, of Google? Show me what the darkness is so that I can know like how you want me to partner with you to be a light. Like, you call everyone to be your hands and feet. You call us to make disciples and to be a light, to shine our light boldly and brightly, not to hide it. I just want eyes to be able to see what is going on here and what you're doing so that I can just partner with you in that, instead of me just like being here without any purpose or any clear mission of, why God sent me here. The two-part beautiful thing is, one, yes, I started to get more comfortable around my manager. Like, of course, it wasn't rainbows and butterflies right away, but I will say, like, by the end of my time on that team, we were on great terms. And I was like so shocked looking back. I was on that team about 18 months. And I remember very clearly at the end of the 18 months, I looked back and I was like, how did this happen? It has to be God. Like, we started off so rocky. I did not think things were gonna go well. We were just like butting heads all the time, totally opposite personality. Just somehow God helped our relationship to be a lot better and our communication to be so much better, and also empathy too. Like, for me to be able to see my manager with eyes of love instead of like fear of like, what is he gonna think, and all that. So that just totally transformed. Like, we had such a great relationship, and to this day I'm so thankful for my time with that manager. I learned so much from him. He became pretty much like a mentor to me in many ways, teaching me things about work and career and life and even finances. So yeah, it was just incredible. But the second, and I think the even more significant thing really was after I prayed that prayer about God, give me eyes to see like the spiritual landscape in this environment, I literally began to very clearly see the need for Jesus in meeting rooms, in conversations, even going down the hallway, like, people are getting coffee or just passing by. I started to get a lot more like spiritual sensitivity to what's going on behind the scenes, like beyond what people show on the surface. It's so easy for people to show a facade of like they're so high achieving and, productive and like, wow, so impressive and so many ways. But I really started to see even like leadership through the eyes of God instead of the eyes of man, which is like, oh wow, like you're so high up and you're like an executive and I'm so intimidated. But I started to see them as people who just really needed Jesus, that were actually deeply unfulfilled and actually unhappy in many ways, but maybe didn't say it, out loud, or wouldn't admit it, of course, in that kind of work environment. So one kind of funny thing that happened in this process I forgot to add was that during this, eye-opening revelation process where God was giving me like new eyes to see, is like putting on a new frame or a new glasses lens to see through his eyes. I actually managed to find somehow another believer in that building, and I was like really excited because, we're Team Jesus. Like, I'm not alone in this mission. And so I connected with him, we got lunch, and I was just asking him, what is the spiritual atmosphere you feel of this building? And I will never forget, it just struck me so hard what he said. He said, this building, I mean, people are stressed, people are tired, and it's honestly where smiles come to die. And I just remember being so like shook and depressed hearing that, because I was like, smiles come to die? Like, as a very smiley person myself, it just was sad to hear. But sure enough, throughout the following weeks and months, as God continued to just show me and just give me new revelation of what was really going on, what people were really experiencing and going through, that's really what I saw, was just like a lot of stress, a lot of emptiness despite outward success and outward fruit that it looked like, like, oh wow, you have everything, you're so comfortable, you have all these luxuries, you have it all, and yet it feels like you have nothing. And yeah, I will never forget that conversation, because it really sparked and fueled an even clearer conviction of, wow, this is why as believers we need to be a light, because there's so much darkness all around us that needs that light so desperately. yeah, I just felt this clarity of like, this is my real mission. Like, of course, I want to do well in my job. I want to honor my boss and serve people around me the best that I can. But basically, God started revealing to me the higher level job description of his kingdom, of like why he sent me and how I could just like be a light. Instead of focusing on like proving myself, I was now focusing on how can I show people God's love and light and hope and peace? How can I just be a conduit of God's love and be his ambassador here in terms of shifting culture, influencing culture? Even though I'm not a leader, I was like very basically entry level. Like I just came out of college, right? Like I didn't have much influence in terms of my positional title, but I knew I carried a lot of influence because I had God with me, Jesus in me, and the Holy Spirit working in me. And through that revelation, I had just so many amazing opportunities to share about God, to bring God into the workplace, to bring believers together, to pray for more believers to come, and they did. Such cool stories. I can't wait to share. But the main point of this video I wanted to share is if you're going through imposter syndrome, which happens a lot and it's very common, I would just encourage you, like really press into bringing that to God and asking him, God, like lift my eyes off of myself instead of like trying to need to prove myself or, prove that I deserve to be here or I'm worthy of being here. Help me to see what you're doing. What's the bigger picture so that I can just like be a part of that mission. It's really not about us at the end of the day. It's not about you or me and, what people think of us and our reputation. That is definitely what the world has conditioned us to think about. Even Moses, like I talked about this a bit in another different video on a totally different subject, but his story just continues to hit me so hard. How in Exodus 3, you see he is going through severe imposter syndrome. How will people believe me or, listen to what I say? And a lot of scholars believe that Moses had a stuttering problem. Like, if I'm a stutterer, like how will I lead people? Like he had just zero clue, like how am I going to do this? Plus the fact that he basically had been exiled, like he ran away. So there's a lot of shame and pain in that whole process of like, oh, I have to go back to this place that I had run away from. All his questions, you can see he was like thinking like, I'm not cut out for this. But how God responds every time is actually God doesn't even give him a pep talk. He's not like, you got this, Moses, like you're actually stronger than you think. Like he doesn't hype him up like that. He points back to himself. I will be with you. I made the heavens and the earth. I feel like that's the same thing for us. Instead of focusing on like, can I do this on my own? Because the truth of the matter is the calling that he calls us into, the assignments for his kingdom purposes, oftentimes will be things that totally feel out of our scope because that's how we're designed to live, is by leaning on God. It says in 2 Corinthians, it's through our weaknesses that God's power, his strength can really show and work through us. And that's how he gets the glory. And that's what he loves doing, is partnering with very flawed, inadequate, little people, like us, but getting to do that with us and being like, kind of like showing off, like, hey, look at how much I can do through you and your humble, willing obedience. Look at how I can multiply what little you have, the loaves and fishes you bring to me, I can multiply. And he just wants to blow us away and everybody else away that we share this with. Try to lean into it and bring it to God instead of dwelling in like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this on my own? Know that it's actually not on you, and ask God for the bigger picture, and he will definitely come through and show you all the things you need to fulfill the calling that he's called you to, and he'll give it to you too. He'll equip you with everything you need and the grace you need to do it and the guidance, and it's not up to us to know what to do exactly or the whole plan or be like, yes, I'm ready, like 100% ready. The life of faith is the life of dependence on God, not on ourselves. So yeah, I hope this encouraged someone out there who needed it. And if it did, please let me know in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up and I will see you in the next one.